The crystalline halls of the galactic judicial complex stretched endlessly in all directions, their translucent walls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that hurt Sarah's human eyes. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, following the floating guide orb that hummed softly as it led her through corridors designed for beings 3 times her height. Her boots clicked against the organic floor with each step, the only purely mechanical sound in a building that seemed to breathe around her. Behind her walked, his massive frame making the already imposing architecture seem almost reasonable in scale. His 4 arms hung loose at his sides, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders beneath the formal court robes that had been hastily altered to fit his unusual physique. They were not common in this part of the galaxy, and certainly not in the highest courts of justice. "You don't have to do this," he rumbled in his deep voice, the translator implant making his words sound stilted and formal despite the emotion she knew lay beneath them. "My people's laws are not your burden to bear." Sarah glanced back at him, noting how the other court attendees gave them a wide berth as they passed. Some stared openly at the unlikely pair, the small human woman in her simple blue dress and the towering alien warrior whose hide told stories of 100 battles. "We've been over this. What affects you affects me now." The guide orb chimed softly and came to a halt before massive doors that spiraled open like the petals of some enormous flower. Beyond lay the primary courtroom of the Galactic Justice Consortium, a vast amphitheater where representatives of dozens of species sat in judgment over matters that could affect entire star systems. The chamber's walls curved upward into darkness, lined with viewing platforms and judicial boxes arranged in complex geometric patterns that somehow managed to give every occupant a clear view of the central speaking area. As they entered, a wave of whispers followed in their wake. Sarah caught fragments of conversation through her translator speculation about the human's presence, confusion over the case's implications, and more than a few expressions of disdain for what many clearly saw as an inferior species, attempting to interfere in matters beyond her understanding. The delegation sat in the section reserved for the accused, their imposing forms draped in the traditional black robes of those facing judgment. Among them, Sarah recognized Clutch brothers and the elders who had raised him after his parents died in the border conflicts with the hegemony. Their faces showed varying degrees of resignation and barely controlled rage at the circumstances that had brought them here. Across the chamber, the prosecution's section gleamed with polished armor and flowing robes of deep purple. The hegemony representatives looked exactly as Sarah had expected, tall, pale beings with elongated limbs and faces that managed to convey both beauty and cruelty in equal measure. At their head sat Executor Prime, whose silver eyes seemed to track every movement in the room with calculating precision. The central speaking area was dominated by a raised platform surrounded by a field of soft blue light. Here, witnesses would present their testimony, evidence would be examined, and fates would be decided according to laws that had governed this part of the galaxy for over 10,000 years. "All rise for the triumvirate of justice," announced a voice that seemed to come from the very air around them. The chamber fell silent as 3 figures materialized on the highest platform. The chief arbiter was a being Sarah had only seen in holographic records, ancient beyond measure, its form shifting between states of matter in patterns that made her eyes water to follow directly. To its left sat Arbiter of the Trade Federation, her crystalline body refracting light into rainbow patterns across the chamber walls. The third figure was Arbiter Thane, representing the military Concordat, his cybernetic enhancements gleaming as his optical sensors swept across the assembled crowd. This tribunal convenes to address the matter of territorial violations, resource theft, and acts of piracy committed by vessels operating under registry. The chief arbiter's voice resonated without sound, somehow speaking directly into every mind present. The accused stand charged with 17 counts of raiding hegemony supply convoys, destruction of military property, and the theft of strategic materials valued at approximately 400 million galactic credits. Stood slowly, his hands clasped behind his back in the formal posture his people used when accepting responsibility. "The charges are acknowledged, honored arbiters. The fleet acted under my command during the operations in question." And yet, Executor Prime rose from her position, her voice carrying easily across the chamber despite its soft tone. "The accused fails to acknowledge the most serious charge of all. The systematic enslavement of sentient beings taken from captured vessels, including the unlawful detention of the human female who now sits among them. Sarah felt her heart skip as hundreds of eyes turned toward her. This was the moment she had been preparing for during the 3-month journey to reach this place. Everything had told her about galactic law, everything she had learned about the complex web of treaties and obligations that held this vast civilization together, had led to this accusation. The human Sarah was taken during the raid on transport vessel Meridian's Hope 18 standard months ago, continued, her silver eyes fixed on Sarah with what might have been sympathy or calculation. According to the testimony of surviving crew members, she was selected personally by the commander and has been held against her will ever since. This constitutes slavery under Article 7 of the Sentient Rights Accord, a crime punishable by dissolution of the offending party's civilization, status, and permanent exile from all consortium territories. The implications of that sentence hung in the air like a physical weight. Sarah had learned enough about galactic politics to understand what it meant. If they lost their status as a recognized civilization, they would become non-entities in the eyes of galactic law. Their worlds could be claimed by anyone strong enough to take them. Their people could be killed or enslaved without legal consequence. It was, in effect, a death sentence for an entire species. However, his voice took on an almost gentle tone, the hegemony recognizes that they are a warrior culture with different customs regarding captives. We are prepared to show mercy if the human female confirms her captive status and requests our protection. She will be relocated to a suitable world where she can live in safety, and the slavery charges will be reduced to unlawful detention. Sarah stood slowly, feeling the weight of every gaze in the chamber. The translator implant at her throat felt cold against her skin as she prepared to speak words that would change everything. "Honored arbiters," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. "I request permission to address this court regarding the charges against and his people." The chief arbiter's form shifted, patterns of light swirling as it considered her request. "You may speak, human Sarah. However, we must inform you that any testimony you provide will be subject to verification through psychic analysis. The truth of your words will be known to this court." Sarah nodded, having expected this. She had spent long hours with learning about the consortium's methods for ensuring honesty in legal proceedings. The thought of having her mind examined by alien telepaths was terrifying, but it was also the only way to make them understand. "Then let them see the truth," she said, stepping forward into the blue light of the speaking platform. "Because the truth is something that will change everything you think you know about this case." The psychic probe felt like ice water flowing through Sarah's mind, alien thoughts brushing against her memories with clinical precision. She forced herself to remain still as the court's telepathic verifiers sifted through her experiences, knowing that any resistance would be interpreted as deception. Around her, the chamber had fallen into absolute silence, the assembled representatives waiting for the analysis to confirm what they all assumed they already knew. "The subject's mind is unusually structured," announced Verifier Eth, a tall being whose elongated skull housed one of the most powerful telepathic organs in known space. "Her thoughts are resilient, compartmentalized in ways that suggest deliberate training. This is unexpected for a human." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The mental exercises had taught her during their journey here had been agonizing to learn, but they were paying off now. Not to hide the truth, but to present it in a way that would force the court to see the complete picture rather than isolated fragments. "Continue the examination," ordered the chief arbiter. "We must understand the full circumstances of her captivity." The probe deepened, and Sarah felt her memories being pulled forward like files from an archive. The verifiers would see everything now: the attack on the Meridian's Hope, the moment she first laid eyes on as he boarded their vessel, the fear she had felt as his warriors secured the ship and rounded up the survivors. But they would also see what came after. The memory crystallized in the shared consciousness of the courtroom Sarah, standing in the cargo hold of the captured transport, her fellow humans cowering behind her as warriors sorted through their possessions. Had moved through the space like a force of nature, his 4 arms coordinating the efficient transfer of supplies, while his face remained impassive behind his combat mask. "Take the medical supplies first," he had commanded his subordinates in the language, his words now translated for the court through Sarah's memory. "These people will need treatment for their injuries before we reach the processing station." Sarah remembered her confusion at the time. Processing station sounded ominous enough, but there had been something in the commander's tone that didn't match the casual cruelty she expected from raiders. When he had approached her specifically, selecting her from among the crew, she had been certain her death was imminent. Instead, he had done something unprecedented in the history of raiding. He had spoken to her directly. "You are the medical officer listed in the ship's manifest," he had said, his English heavily accented but clear. "Your people are injured. Will you tend to them if I provide the necessary supplies?" The memory rippled through the courtroom's shared consciousness, and Sarah heard gasps from several of the observers. Warriors simply did not negotiate with their captives. They took what they wanted and left the consequences to others. "I will," her past self had answered, surprising herself with her own boldness. "But I want to know what you plan to do with us afterward." "That depends on many things," had replied, and Sarah could feel the verifier's surprise at the careful consideration in his words. "But I give you my honor that you will live long enough to see your people safely delivered to a neutral station." The memory shifted, showing days aboard the ship where Sarah had expected to find herself in some kind of prison cell. Instead, she had been given quarters near the medical bay and allowed to move freely through most of the vessel. Had visited regularly, initially to check on her patients, but gradually for longer conversations about human culture, medicine, and philosophy. "This is highly irregular," Arbiter Thane interjected, his cybernetic voice cutting through the psychic link. "Raiders do not typically engage in cultural exchange with their captives." "No," Sarah said aloud, her voice carrying both to the chamber and through the psychic connection. "They don't. That's what made different from the beginning. He saw us as people, not just cargo to be processed." The memories continued to unfold conversations that stretched late into the ship's night cycle, discussions of human resilience and adaptability that clearly fascinated the alien commander. Sarah remembered the moment she realized that was conducting raids not for personal gain or cultural glory, but out of desperate necessity. His people were dying. The hegemony's expansion into space had been characterized as peaceful integration in the official records, but the reality was far different. Worlds that refused to accept hegemony governance found their supply lines cut, their trade relationships severed, their colonies isolated until starvation and disease forced them to capitulate. The proud and independent by nature had chosen to fight rather than submit. But they were losing. For every hegemony supply convoy they captured, 10 more reached their destinations. For every small victory, the noose tightened a little more around their remaining worlds. Raids were the desperate actions of a species facing extinction through bureaucratic genocide. "These accusations are preposterous," Executor Prime's voice cut through the psychic link like a blade. "The hegemony has followed all proper protocols for territorial expansion. If they cannot adapt to civilized governance, their fate is their own responsibility." The verifiers pulled another memory forward, and Sarah felt her anger from that long-ago conversation burning fresh in her mind. She had confronted about the morality of raiding civilian vessels, challenging him to justify taking supplies from innocent traders and passengers. "Do you know what happened to the Oran system?" he had asked her, his usual composed demeanor cracking slightly. They were a peaceful species, artists and philosophers who had never developed significant military capabilities. The hegemony offered them protection and prosperity in exchange for integration into their economic system. Sarah's memory showed her the holographic records had shared with her that night. The Oran had accepted the hegemony's offer, believing they were joining a galactic community as equals. Within 5 years, their traditional art forms had been deemed culturally inappropriate and banned. Their philosophers were relocated to education centers where they could learn proper hegemony thinking. Their children were sent to boarding institutions where they would be raised as proper hegemony citizens. By the 10th year, the Oran language was forbidden except in private homes. By the 15th, even that restriction was lifted because there were no longer enough native speakers to matter. The species still existed, technically, but their culture, their identity, everything that had made them unique in the galaxy had been systematically erased. "This is the fate that awaits us if we surrender," had told her. "Our children will grow up speaking hegemony standard, worshipping hegemony gods, thinking hegemony thoughts. Within 2 generations, there will be no meaningful difference between and any other subject race. We will exist, but we will not be ourselves." The psychic probe shifted to more recent memories, showing the moment everything had changed between Sarah and her supposed captor. It had been during a particularly successful raid on a hegemony military transport. Had returned to the ship bloodied and exhausted, his usual careful composure completely shattered. 17 dead, he had told her when she found him in his quarters, staring out at the stars through the viewport. 17 of my warriors who will never see their families again. And for what? Enough supplies to keep our colony ships running for another month before we have to do this again. Sarah remembered reaching out to touch his arm, offering what comfort she could to someone carrying the weight of his entire species' survival. She had expected him to pull away, to maintain the professional distance that had marked their relationship up to that point. Instead, he had broken down completely, the carefully controlled facade crumbling as the full burden of leadership overwhelmed him. She had held him as he grieved for his fallen warriors, for the moral compromises his situation forced him to make, for the slow death of everything his people had once been. I never wanted to be a raider, he had whispered against her shoulder. I was trained as an engineer. I wanted to build things, to explore new systems and catalog their wonders. Instead, I lead attacks on civilians and watch good people die for the crime of standing between my people and extinction. That had been the beginning of something that every expectation, every assumption about human-alien relationships that either of their species had ever held. Over the following months, as they continued their desperate campaign against impossible odds, Sarah had transformed from captive to advisor to something far more significant. She had helped plan raids that would minimize civilian casualties while maximizing strategic impact. She had negotiated with captured crews, using her understanding of human psychology to reduce conflicts and prevent unnecessary deaths. Most importantly, she had offered something he had never expected to find among the stars, someone who truly understood the impossible position he faced and chose to stand with him anyway. The verifiers from her mind with obvious reluctance, their alien thoughts reflecting confusion and surprise at what they had discovered. In the chamber around her, the silence had deepened to an almost physical presence as representatives from dozens of species processed what they had witnessed through the psychic link. The examination is complete, Verifier Eth announced, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that was clearly unusual for such proceedings. The subject's memories are consistent and truthful. However, the nature of her relationship with the accused appears to be unprecedented in our legal framework. Executor Prime rose from her position, her silver eyes flashing with barely controlled anger. Regardless of any personal feelings that may have developed, the fundamental charges remain unchanged. The human was taken against her will during an act of piracy. Whatever happened afterward does not alter that basic fact. Sarah felt tense behind her, knowing that this was the moment that would determine not just his fate, but the future of his entire species. She had one chance to make the court understand, one opportunity to present a truth that would force them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the situation. "You're right," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the chamber. "I was taken against my will during that first raid, but that's not the whole truth, and it's not the truth that matters for these proceedings." She paused, making sure she had the attention of every being in the room before speaking the words that would change everything. Because 6 months ago, when offered to arrange safe passage for me to any human world of my choosing, I declined. When he offered to transfer me to a neutral station where I could book passage home, I refused. And when he asked me why I would choose to stay with a raiding fleet instead of returning to the safety of human space, I gave him an answer that I now repeat before this court. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of voices as representatives from dozens of species attempted to process what they had just heard. Translators struggled to keep pace with the flood of commentary, creating a babel of confusion that echoed off the crystalline walls. Sarah stood perfectly still in the center of the speaking platform, allowing the chaos to wash over her while she prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most important words she would ever speak. "Order," the chief arbiter's voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk, its psychic resonance forcing immediate silence throughout the chamber. "The human will be allowed to complete her statement without interruption." Executor Prime remained standing, her pale features twisted with what appeared to be genuine bewilderment. "Honored arbiters, this is clearly an attempt to subvert the legal process through emotional manipulation. The Stockholm Syndrome phenomenon is well documented in human psychology. A captive forming attachment to their captor, does not invalidate the crime of taking them in the first place. The hegemony representative raises a valid concern, acknowledged Arbiter, her crystalline form refracting the chamber's light into shifting rainbow patterns. Human, are you claiming that your current status is entirely voluntary? Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of not just her own future, but that of an entire species resting on her next words. I am claiming something far more significant than that, honored arbiters. I am claiming that the legal framework being used to judge this case is fundamentally flawed because it fails to account for the reality of what they are facing. She gestured toward the prosecution section, where hegemony representatives sat in their pristine uniforms and flowing robes. The charges speak of piracy and theft, as though and his people are common criminals motivated by greed or malice. But the evidence clearly shows that these are acts of desperation by a species facing cultural genocide. The hegemony's expansion policies are not on trial here, interjected sharply. The accused has committed documented acts of piracy against civilian vessels. The motivation behind these crimes is irrelevant to their prosecution. Is it? Sarah challenged, turning to face the tribunal directly. Because I've studied your legal codes during the journey here, and I found something very interesting in Article 12 of the Survival Doctrine. Any recognized civilization has the right to take extraordinary measures to ensure its continued existence when faced with imminent extinction, provided those measures are proportionate to the threat and minimize harm to innocent parties. A murmur rippled through the chamber as legal scholars among the various delegations began accessing their databases to verify her citation. Sarah could see Arbiter Thane's optical sensors flickering rapidly as his cybernetic implants processed the relevant legal precedents. The survival doctrine has not been invoked in over 3,000 years, the military arbiter stated after a moment. It requires proof of existential threat that cannot be addressed through standard diplomatic channels. Then let me provide that proof, Sarah said, pulling a data crystal from her dress pocket. This contains comprehensive documentation of hegemony expansion tactics over the past 50 years, cross-referenced with cultural survival statistics for the species they've integrated. The patterns are unmistakable. She activated the crystal, and holographic displays materialized above the speaking platform. Charts and graphs filled the air, showing the systematic erosion of cultural identity that followed hegemony integration. Language suppression rates, traditional practice prohibition timelines, genetic mixing programs designed to eliminate distinct physical characteristics, all presented with the clinical precision of academic research. The average time between initial hegemony contact and complete cultural assimilation is 47 standard years, Sarah continued, her voice steady as she presented data that told the story of dozens of civilizations. In 93% of cases, the absorbed species retains fewer than 5% of their original cultural practices by the third generation. In 78% of cases, their original language becomes extinct within 60 years of integration. The holographic displays shifted, showing specific examples of species that had accepted hegemony, protection, and subsequently vanished as distinct cultures. The Oran that had spoken of were there, but so were dozens of others proud civilizations reduced to footnotes in hegemony administrative records. This is propaganda and distortion, protested, though her voice lacked its earlier certainty. The integration process preserves the valuable aspects of subject cultures while eliminating harmful or primitive practices. It is a civilizing force that has brought peace and prosperity to countless worlds. Peace and prosperity for whom? Sarah shot back. Show me one example of a species that has maintained its distinct identity after 50 years of hegemony rule. Show me one integrated civilization that still speaks its original language, practices its traditional arts, or maintains its ancestral belief systems. The prosecutor fell silent, clearly unable to provide such examples. Around the chamber, representatives from various species were accessing their own databases, and Sarah could see the growing recognition in their faces as they discovered the same patterns she had found. They saw what happened to their neighbors, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she pressed her advantage. They watched the systematic elimination of everything that made those species unique. When the hegemony made their generous offer of integration, people had to choose between immediate military defeat and slow cultural death. They chose to fight. She gestured toward the delegation, where sat surrounded by his surviving comrades. These raids weren't acts of piracy, they were acts of war. A war for survival that they were forced to fight alone because the rest of the galaxy was either too frightened or too comfortable to acknowledge what was happening. Even if we accept this interpretation, Arbiter interjected, the fact remains that civilian vessels were targeted. Innocent traders and passengers were threatened and robbed. How does the survival doctrine justify attacks on non-combatants? Sarah had expected this question, and her answer was ready. Because the hegemony deliberately uses civilian infrastructure to support their expansion. Those innocent cargo ships were carrying cultural suppression technology to newly integrated worlds. Those harmless passenger vessels were transporting hegemony administrators and enforcement specialists to eliminate local resistance. She activated another section of her data crystal, showing shipping manifests and passenger lists from the attacked vessels. Educational software designed to replace local learning systems with hegemony standard curricula. Psychoactive drugs used to make subject populations more compliant during the integration process. Teams of cultural specialists whose job was to identify and eliminate problematic local traditions. Every single vessel attacked by forces was carrying something directly related to the hegemony's expansion program, Sarah stated. There were no attacks on purely commercial shipping, no raids on genuine civilian transports. The targeting was precise and strategic, designed to disrupt the infrastructure of cultural genocide while minimizing harm to innocent individuals. And what of the harm to you? Executor Prime's voice carried a note of desperation as she played what appeared to be her final card. Were you not an innocent civilian who was kidnapped and held against your will? Sarah smiled, finally reaching the moment she had been building toward through all of her testimony. That brings us to the most important point of all, honored arbiters. Because the truth is that while I was initially taken against my will, I chose to stay. Not because of any psychological manipulation or coercion, but because I came to understand that, and his people were fighting for something that transcended individual comfort or safety. She turned to look directly at the delegation, meeting eyes across the chamber. They were fighting for the right to exist as themselves, the right to raise their children in their own traditions, speak their own language, practice their own customs, the right to be different in a galaxy that increasingly demands conformity. The chamber fell silent as Sarah's words resonated through the assembled delegates. Many of them represented species that had faced similar pressures from larger, more powerful civilizations. The idea that resistance to cultural extinction could be legally justified was clearly striking a chord that went far beyond the specifics of this particular case. I stayed, Sarah continued, because I realized that this wasn't just about it was about the principle that diversity of thought, culture, and identity is worth preserving, that the galaxy is stronger when it contains multiple ways of thinking and being, not weaker. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before delivering her final statement. And I stayed because somewhere in the midst of fighting for his people's survival, taught me something that my own supposedly enlightened human civilization never had. He showed me what it means to truly love someone, not just their body or their convenience or their usefulness, but their entire being, their culture, their people, their struggles and dreams and fears. The emotional weight of her confession rippled through the chamber, enhanced by the residual psychic connections from the earlier verification process. Sarah could feel the surprise and confusion of the assembled representatives as they processed the implications of what she was saying. You see, she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the vast room, I didn't just choose to stay with the fleet. 6 months ago, in a private ceremony witnessed by his clan elders and recorded according to both human and legal traditions, I made a much more significant choice. She straightened her shoulders, meeting the gaze of each arbiter in turn before speaking the words that would change the entire nature of the proceedings. Honored tribunal, I stand before you today not as a victim of kidnapping or a casualty of piracy, but as the legally bonded mate of the. And under the marriage protection clauses of the Galactic Rights Charter, I formally invoke my right to legal immunity for any actions taken by my spouse in defense of our shared household and clan. The explosion of voices that followed her announcement made the earlier disruption seem like whispered conversation by comparison. Sarah stood calmly in the eye of the storm, watching as the careful legal framework the hegemony had constructed around this case began to crumble under the weight of laws and precedents they had never considered. The game had changed completely, and everyone in the chamber knew it. The chief arbiter's form collapsed and reformed 3 times in rapid succession, patterns of energy swirling chaotically as it processed the unprecedented legal implications of Sarah's announcement. Throughout the chamber, representatives from dozens of species were frantically consulting their databases, searching for precedents that might guide them through the labyrinth of law that had just opened before them. "This is absurd." Executor Prime's composure finally cracked completely, her silver eyes blazing with fury as she rose from her position. "A human cannot simply declare herself married to an alien pirate and expect that to invalidate legitimate criminal charges." And yet, Arbiter Thane's mechanical voice cut through the chaos with digital precision. "The marriage protection clauses of the Galactic Rights Charter are quite specific. Article 15, Section 7 clearly states that legally bonded mates of different species cannot be compelled to testify against each other, nor can actions taken in defense of the family unit be prosecuted without the consent of both parties." Sarah felt a surge of triumph as the military arbiter's words confirmed what she had spent months researching during her journey to this place. The law had been written to protect couples from persecution, but its broad language created exactly the loophole she needed. "Furthermore," Arbiter added, her crystalline form refracting light in agitated patterns, "if the marriage is legitimate under both human and law, then the human female's presence with the accused fleet cannot be characterized as kidnapping or unlawful detention. She would have been exercising her legal right to with her chosen mate. The marriage must first be as legitimate," the chief arbiter announced, its voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Summon the marriage verification specialists. We will examine the documentation and determine whether this union meets the standards required under galactic law." Sarah's heart pounded as she realized that her carefully constructed legal strategy was about to face its first real test. The marriage ceremony had been conducted according to ancient traditions in the presence of clan elders who served as official witnesses. But would it meet the technical requirements of a legal system designed by species who had never imagined such a union? The verification specialists materialized on the speaking platform, 3 beings whose combined expertise in law was legendary throughout the galaxy. Master Jurist Al of the Academic Consortium was a walking database of legal precedents, his cybernetically enhanced brain containing the complete text of every treaty and statute ever by the galactic government. Beside him stood Cultural Analyst, whose deep understanding of social customs had helped resolve hundreds of complex marriage disputes. The third specialist was Advocate, representing the Species Rights Commission and carrying the authority to make binding determinations on matters of relations. "Present your documentation," Master Jurist Al commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to unraveling the most complex legal tangles in known space. Sarah activated another section of her data crystal, and holographic documents filled the air above the speaking platform. Marriage certificates written in both human standard and classical script, witness testimonies from the clan elders who had performed the ceremony, even video recordings of the ritual itself in all its alien splendor. The specialists examined everything with meticulous care, their different areas of expertise allowing them to verify every aspect of the union from multiple angles. Cultural analysts studied the ritual elements, confirming that each step had been performed according to legitimate tradition. Advocate reviewed the witness testimonies, verifying the identities and legal standing of everyone involved. Master Jurist Al cross-referenced the entire procedure against the requirements of both human and galactic marriage law. "The ceremony appears to be legitimate," Cultural Analyst announced after several minutes of intense examination. "All traditional elements of bonding ritual have been properly observed, including the exchange of clan markings, the sharing of ancestral memory stones, and the formal acceptance of the female into the male's family line. The witnesses are all recognized members of the community with the legal standing to officiate such ceremonies," added Advocate. "Their testimonies are consistent and properly documented according to both local custom and galactic standards." Master Jurist Al took longer with his analysis, his enhanced neural implants processing thousands of legal precedents in search of any technicality that might invalidate the union. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute certainty. The marriage satisfies all requirements under Article 23 of the Relations Code. Both parties were of legal age according to their respective species standards. Both provided informed consent without coercion, and the ceremony was conducted according to the legitimate traditions of at least one party's culture. The union is legally recognized under galactic law. The announcement sent another wave of chaos through the chamber as the implications became clear to everyone present. If Sarah's marriage was legitimate, then the entire foundation of the hegemony's case had just collapsed. She could not be considered a kidnapping victim if she was legally entitled to be wherever her husband was. This changes nothing. His voice rose to nearly a shriek as she saw her carefully constructed prosecution crumbling before her eyes. The original crimes still occurred. The raids, the theft, the attacks on civilian vessels, all of these happened before any marriage took place. Actually, Sarah said, her voice cutting through the prosecutor's protests with calm precision, that's not entirely accurate. While it's true that my initial capture preceded our marriage, the legal principle of retroactive spousal immunity applies when one spouse's actions were taken in direct defense of the other's safety or well-being. She gestured toward another section of her documentation, calling up medical records and incident reports from the Meridian's Hope. The ship I was traveling on was not the innocent passenger vessel described in the hegemony's charges. It was carrying experimental bioweapons designed specifically to target physiology. The holographic displays showed shipping manifests that had been classified at the highest levels of hegemony security, documents that Sarah had helped steal during one of their raids on a military research facility. Canisters of engineered pathogens, atmospheric processors designed to make worlds uninhabitable for non-hegemony species, genetic targeting systems that could eliminate entire bloodlines with surgical precision. The Meridian's Hope was en route to the frontier with enough biological weapons to sterilize 3 colony worlds, Sarah continued, her voice growing harder as she revealed the full scope of what they had discovered. This raid prevented a genocide that would have killed millions of his people, including the clan elders who would later officiate our marriage ceremony. The chamber fell into stunned silence as the assembled representatives processed this revelation. The implications went far beyond the specifics of this case. If the hegemony was developing and deploying bioweapons against species that resisted integration, then their entire expansion program was built on war crimes of the highest order. These accusations are completely unfounded, protested, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. The cargo manifests from the Meridian's Hope show only standard colonization supplies and medical equipment. Manifests, Sarah replied simply. The real cargo documentation was stored in encrypted files that required hegemony military clearance to access. Files that we obtained during our raid on Research Station Omega-7, along with communications between hegemony high command and their biological weapons division. She activated another hologram, showing intercepted messages that discussed the problem in terms that left no doubt about the hegemony's ultimate intentions. Plans to introduce supposedly beneficial medical treatments that would actually sterilize the species over several generations. Atmospheric modification programs designed to slowly poison the air on worlds. Cultural integration initiatives that were revealed to be psychological warfare operations designed to break the species' will to resist. Every raid conducted by forces targeted infrastructure related to this genocide program, Sarah stated. Medical supplies that were actually biological weapons. Personnel transports carrying death squads disguised as cultural advisors. Communication relays coordinating the systematic extinction of an entire species. The chief arbiter's form stabilized as it processed this new information, patterns of light coalescing into something resembling focused attention. If these allegations are accurate, then the nature of these proceedings must be fundamentally reconsidered. Advocate, what are the implications under the genocide prevention protocols? The species rights advocate consulted her own databases before responding, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with such horrors before. The genocide prevention protocols take precedence over all other legal considerations. Any individual or group that takes action to prevent or halt genocide cannot be prosecuted for crimes committed in the course of those efforts, provided that such crimes are proportionate to the threat being addressed. Furthermore, she continued, Any government or organization found to be engaging in genocide loses all legal standing in galactic courts. Their representatives cannot bring charges, their territorial claims become void, and their protection under galactic law is permanently revoked. Executor Prime looked as though she had been struck by lightning. The implications of what the advocate had just said were staggering. If the hegemony was found guilty of attempted genocide, then not only would all charges against be dropped, but the hegemony itself would become an outlaw state subject to immediate intervention by galactic forces. These documents could be forgeries, she said desperately, grasping for any argument that might save her case. Fabricated evidence created by the accused to justify their criminal actions. Then let us verify their authenticity, the chief arbiter declared. Summon the Technical Analysis Corps. We will examine every byte of data, every quantum signature, every trace of digital provenance. If these documents are genuine, then we are dealing with crimes that threaten the stability of our entire civilization. As the technical specialists began their work, Sarah allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. The legal framework she had constructed was holding up under scrutiny, but she knew that the most dangerous part of her strategy was yet to come. Because even if she could prove that the hegemony was guilty of attempted genocide, even if she could establish that actions were legally justified, there was still one more revelation that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. The truth about why a human woman had been on that ship in the first place, and what her presence there revealed about humanity's role in the hegemony's expansion program. While we wait for the technical analysis, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent chamber, perhaps the tribunal would be interested in understanding how I came to be aboard the Meridian's Hope in the first place. Because that story reveals a truth that will change how this court views not just this case, but the entire relationship between humanity and the hegemony. She paused, meeting the gaze of each arbiter in turn, before delivering the words that would transform everything. You see, I wasn't a passenger on that ship at all. I was part of its crew. Specifically, I was the chief medical officer assigned to oversee the deployment of those bioweapons against the... The silence that followed Sarah's confession was so absolute that she could hear the subtle harmonics of the chamber's life support systems, the barely audible whisper of recycled air moving through crystalline passages designed for beings who breathed different atmospheres than her own. Every eye in the vast amphitheater was fixed on her, and she could feel the weight of their attention like a physical force pressing down on her shoulders. You were complicit in genocide, Arbiter Thane stated, his mechanical voice devoid of the emotion that rippled through the assembled delegates. Yet you now stand before this court as a witness against the very program you helped to create. Sarah nodded slowly, having known that this moment would be the most dangerous part of her testimony. I was complicit, yes, but not willingly and not with full knowledge of what I was truly participating in. She activated the final section of her data crystal, and new holographic displays materialized above the speaking platform. Personnel files, recruitment documents, training records, all bearing the insignia of human medical institutions, but processed through hegemony administrative systems. Hegemony's recruitment of human medical personnel began 18 months ago, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. We were told we were participating in a humanitarian mission, bringing advanced medical care to underdeveloped species in the Outer Rim territories. The pay was excellent, the prestige significant, and the opportunity to help lesser civilizations seemed like the fulfillment of everything we had been taught about humanity's role in the galaxy. The documents floating above her showed the careful selection process that had brought her to that ship. Psychological profiles ensuring that recruits were idealistic enough to believe the cover story, but pragmatic enough to follow orders without asking too many questions. Medical expertise evaluations focusing specifically on knowledge of alien physiologies and biological systems. Security clearances that granted access to information, while restricting communication with anyone outside the program. None of us knew what we were really being asked to do, Sarah continued. The biological agents were presented as preventive vaccines, designed to protect vulnerable alien populations from diseases that might be accidentally introduced by human contact. The atmospheric modification equipment was described as environmental protection technology, meant to shield primitive species from the harmful effects of industrial development. Cultural analyst leaned forward in his position among the verification specialists. You claim ignorance, yet you were the chief medical officer. Surely you would have recognized the true nature of these weapons during the course of your duties. I did, Sarah admitted, and she could feel surprise rippling through their psychic bond from across the chamber. This was information she had never shared with him, secrets she had carried alone through all the months of their relationship. 3 days before this raid on our ship, I discovered the truth about what we were carrying. She gestured toward a section of the holographic display that showed her own medical analysis reports, documents that had been flagged for security review and never transmitted to their intended recipients. I ran independent tests on the so-called vaccines and discovered that they were specifically designed to target reproductive systems, not to protect them from disease, but to ensure that their birth rate would decline by 90% within a single generation. The chamber erupted in gasps and exclamations as the assembled representatives processed the implications of her revelation. Genocide through sterilization was considered one of the most heinous crimes in galactic law, a violation so severe that species had been permanently exiled from civilized space for even attempting it. The atmospheric processors were worse, Sarah continued, her voice growing harder as she revealed the full scope of the hegemony's plan. They were designed to release airborne agents that would gradually alter the brain chemistry of any who breathed them. Over the course of 6 months, the affected individuals would lose all desire to maintain their traditional culture or resist integration into hegemony society. They would become willing collaborators in the destruction of their own civilization. Executor Prime had gone completely pale, her silver eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine shock at the scope of the operation being revealed. These allegations are monstrous, she whispered, and for the first time since the proceedings began, her voice carried no trace of the composed authority she had displayed earlier. If such a program existed, I would have known about it. Would you? Sarah challenged, turning to face the hegemony representative directly. Because according to the communications I accessed, this operation was classified at levels that excluded even senior diplomatic personnel. The people who planned this genocide knew that many hegemony citizens would refuse to participate if they understood what was really happening. She activated another hologram, showing organizational charts that revealed the true structure of the bioweapons program. A shadow organization within the hegemony government, operating with virtually unlimited resources, and answering only to a council of individuals whose identities were hidden behind layers of security classifications. The Shadow Collective, Master Jurist Albrecht, his enhanced neural implants clearly recognizing the organizational patterns displayed in the documents. We have suspected their existence for decades, but could never prove it. A cabal of extremists operating within various galactic governments, dedicated to the elimination of cultural diversity through any means necessary. Sarah nodded grimly. They recruited humans specifically because our species has a reputation for medical expertise and humanitarian intentions. Our involvement would provide perfect cover for their operations, while ensuring that if the program was ever discovered, humanity would bear the blame rather than the hegemony leadership. The implications of this revelation rippled through the chamber like shock waves. If humans were being used as unwitting pawns in a genocidal conspiracy, then the entire framework of relations would need to be reconsidered. How many other humanitarian programs were actually covers for elimination efforts? How many species had been quietly exterminated, while the galaxy congratulated itself on its enlightened approach to less developed civilizations? When I discovered the truth, Sarah continued, I tried to alert the authorities. I sent encrypted messages to Human Command, to Galactic Oversight Committees, to anyone I thought might be able to stop what was about to happen. Every single transmission was intercepted and blocked by the ship's security systems. She paused, meeting gaze across the chamber, and seeing the understanding that was dawning in his alien features. By the time your warriors boarded our ship, I had less than 12 hours before we reached the target system. I was trapped on a vessel full of biological weapons, surrounded by colleagues who either didn't know the truth or were too frightened to act on it, with no way to warn the people who were about to be murdered. And then spoke to you directly, the chief arbiter observed, its form stabilizing as it processed the full scope of what Sarah was revealing. A conversation that changed everything. He asked me to help treat the injured, Sarah said, her voice soft with the memory of that first encounter. Such a simple request, but it showed me something I hadn't expected to find among the raiders. Compassion for enemies. Concern for people who had been carrying weapons designed to destroy his entire species. She turned back toward the delegation, seeing the pride and love in his expression as he listened to her defend not just his actions, but his character before the highest court in known space. Over the following days, as I worked to save lives that any other raider would have simply discarded, I began to understand what kind of person I was dealing with. Someone who could have taken our ship by force and killed everyone aboard, but chose instead to minimize casualties and protect non-combatants. Someone who could have used the biological weapons we carried against hegemony targets, but instead chose to destroy them rather than employ tools of genocide even against his enemies. The chamber had fallen silent again, but this time the quiet was thoughtful rather than shocked. The assembled representatives were beginning to see the larger picture that Sarah had been painting through her testimony, a story of moral complexity that transcended simple categories of criminal and victim. I stayed with initially because I felt responsible for what my people had almost done to his, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she approached the climax of her testimony. But I chose to bond with him because I came to understand that he represented something rare and precious in this galaxy, the courage to do what is right even when it comes at terrible personal cost. She gestured toward the evidence that surrounded them, the documents and recordings that painted a picture of conspiracy and genocide spanning multiple star systems. Everything we've revealed here today was obtained through raids that put and his warriors at constant risk of death or capture. They could have fled to the outer rim and lived quiet lives in exile. Instead, they chose to fight for justice not just for their own people, but for every species threatened by the Shadow Collective's genocidal agenda. The chief arbiter's form began to shift and consolidate, patterns of energy coalescing into something resembling focused determination. The evidence presented to this tribunal reveals crimes of unprecedented scope and severity. Technical analysis confirms the authenticity of all documents, and psychic verification confirms the truthfulness of all testimony. We must now consider how to proceed in the face of these revelations. The charges against and his warriors are hereby dismissed, Arbiter declared, her crystalline form blazing with reflected light. Not only were their actions legally justified under the genocide prevention protocols, but they represent the highest traditions of moral courage in the face of systematic atrocity. Furthermore, Arbiter Thane added, his mechanical voice carrying the weight of military authority, the evidence presented here demands immediate investigation of the Shadow Collective's operations throughout galactic space. Emergency warrants will be issued for the arrest of all identified conspirators, and full protective status is hereby granted to the people pending resolution of the broader investigation. Executor Prime rose slowly from her position, her face showing a mixture of relief and determination that suggested she had genuinely been unaware of her government's involvement in genocide. The hegemony formally withdraws all charges and requests permission to cooperate fully with the investigation. If our administrative systems have been infiltrated by these criminals, we want them exposed and prosecuted to the full extent of galactic law. But Sarah wasn't finished. There was one more truth that needed to be spoken, one final revelation that would ensure this moment became a turning point rather than just another legal victory. "Honored arbiters," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the chamber, "there is something else this court needs to understand. Something about why the Shadow Collective chose to recruit humans for their genocidal program, and why that choice reveals a truth about our species that even we are only beginning to understand." She paused, feeling the attention of every being in the room focused on her words, as she prepared to speak the truth that would change humanity's place in the galaxy forever. They chose us because we are the only species they've encountered that is capable of both incredible compassion and necessary violence. We can love our enemies even while fighting them. We can show mercy to those who would destroy us and find common ground with beings who seem utterly alien. The Shadow Collective thought they could use these traits to make us perfect tools for genocide. Sarah smiled, feeling love and pride flowing through their bond as she delivered her final words. What they didn't understand is that these same traits make us perfect guardians for the diversity and freedom they seek to destroy. We will love fiercely, protect relentlessly, and stand with anyone who fights for the right to exist as themselves. Whether they walk on 2 legs or 4, breathe oxygen or methane, worship gods or science or nothing at all, if they choose to be our allies, They will find no more loyal friends in all the galaxy. The chamber erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the massive structure. Representatives from dozens of species rising to their feet in acknowledgement of words that offered hope for a future where difference was celebrated rather than eliminated. And in the center of it all, Sarah stood with tears streaming down her face, finally free to love the alien warrior who had shown her what it meant to fight for something greater than herself. The galaxy was vast and dangerous, full of those who would destroy everything unique and precious for the sake of uniformity and control. But they would not stand alone against the darkness. Humanity had found its place among the stars, and it was standing guard over the light. The crystalline halls of the Galactic Judicial Complex stretched endlessly in all directions, their translucent walls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that hurt Sarah's human eyes. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, following the floating guide orb that hummed softly as it led her through corridors designed for beings 3 times her height. Her boots clicked against the organic floor with each step, the only purely mechanical sound in a building that seemed to breathe around her. Behind her walked, his massive frame making the already imposing architecture seem almost reasonable in scale. His 4 arms hung loose at his sides, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders beneath the formal court robes that had been hastily altered to fit his unusual physique. They were not common in this part of the galaxy, and certainly not in the highest courts of justice. "You don't have to do this," he rumbled in his deep voice, the translator implant making his words sound stilted and formal despite the emotion she knew lay beneath them. "My people's laws are not your burden to bear." Sarah glanced back at him, noting how the other court attendees gave them a wide berth as they passed. Some stared openly at the unlikely pair, the small human woman in her simple blue dress and the towering alien warrior whose hide told stories of 100 battles. "We've been over this. What affects you affects me now." The guide orb chimed softly and came to a halt before massive doors that spiraled open like the petals of some enormous flower. Beyond lay the primary courtroom of the Galactic Justice Consortium, a vast amphitheater where representatives of dozens of species sat in judgment over matters that could affect entire star systems. The chamber's walls curved upward into darkness, lined with viewing platforms and judicial boxes arranged in complex geometric patterns that somehow managed to give every occupant a clear view of the central speaking area. As they entered, a wave of whispers followed in their wake. Sarah caught fragments of conversation through her translator speculation about the human's presence, confusion over the case's implications, and more than a few expressions of disdain for what many clearly saw as an inferior species, attempting to interfere in matters beyond her understanding. The delegation sat in the section reserved for the accused, their imposing forms draped in the traditional black robes of those facing judgment. Among them, Sarah recognized Clutch brothers and the elders who had raised him after his parents died in the border conflicts with the hegemony. Their faces showed varying degrees of resignation and barely controlled rage at the circumstances that had brought them here. Across the chamber, the prosecution's section gleamed with polished armor and flowing robes of deep purple. The hegemony representatives looked exactly as Sarah had expected, tall, pale beings with elongated limbs and faces that managed to convey both beauty and cruelty in equal measure. At their head sat Executor Prime, whose silver eyes seemed to track every movement in the room with calculating precision. The central speaking area was dominated by a raised platform surrounded by a field of soft blue light. Here, witnesses would present their testimony, evidence would be examined, and fates would be decided according to laws that had governed this part of the galaxy for over 10,000 years. "All rise for the triumvirate of justice," announced a voice that seemed to come from the very air around them. The chamber fell silent as 3 figures materialized on the highest platform. The chief arbiter was a being Sarah had only seen in holographic records, ancient beyond measure, its form shifting between states of matter in patterns that made her eyes water to follow directly. To its left sat Arbiter of the Trade Federation, her crystalline body refracting light into rainbow patterns across the chamber walls. The third figure was Arbiter Thane, representing the military Concordat, his cybernetic enhancements gleaming as his optical sensors swept across the assembled crowd. This tribunal convenes to address the matter of territorial violations, resource theft, and acts of piracy committed by vessels operating under registry. The chief arbiter's voice resonated without sound. somehow speaking directly into every mind present. The accused stand charged with 17 counts of raiding hegemony supply convoys, destruction of military property, and the theft of strategic materials valued at approximately 400 million galactic credits. Stood slowly, his hands clasped behind his back in the formal posture his people used when accepting responsibility. The charges are acknowledged, honored arbiters. The fleet acted under my command during the operations in question. And yet, Executor Prime rose from her position, her voice carrying easily across the chamber despite its soft tone. The accused fails to acknowledge the most serious charge of all: the systematic enslavement of sentient beings taken from captured vessels, including the unlawful detention of the human female who now sits among them. Sarah felt her heart skip as hundreds of eyes turned toward her. This was the moment she had been preparing for during the 3-month journey to reach this place. Everything had told her about galactic law, everything she had learned about the complex web of treaties and obligations that held this vast civilization together, had led to this accusation. The human Sarah was taken during the raid on transport vessel Meridian's Hope 18 standard months ago, continued, her silver eyes fixed on Sarah with what might have been sympathy or calculation. According to the testimony of surviving crew members, she was selected personally by the commander and has been held against her will ever since. This constitutes slavery under Article 7 of the Sentient Rights Accord, a crime punishable by dissolution of the offending party's civilization, status, and permanent exile from all consortium territories. The implications of that sentence hung in the air like a physical weight. Sarah had learned enough about galactic politics to understand what it meant. If they lost their status as a recognized civilization, they would become non-entities in the eyes of galactic law. Their worlds could be claimed by anyone strong enough to take them. Their people could be killed or enslaved without legal consequence. It was, in effect, a death sentence for an entire species. However, his voice took on an almost gentle tone, the hegemony recognizes that they are a warrior culture with different customs regarding captives. We are prepared to show mercy if the human female confirms her captive status and requests our protection. She will be relocated to a suitable world where she can live in safety, and the slavery charges will be reduced to unlawful detention. Sarah stood slowly, feeling the weight of every gaze in the chamber. The translator implant at her throat felt cold against her skin as she prepared to speak words that would change everything. "Honored arbiters," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. "I request permission to address this court regarding the charges against and his people." The chief arbiter's form shifted, patterns of light swirling as it considered her request. "You may speak, human Sarah. However, we must inform you that any testimony you provide will be subject to verification through psychic analysis. The truth of your words will be known to this court." Sarah nodded, having expected this. She had spent long hours with learning about the consortium's methods for ensuring honesty in legal proceedings. The thought of having her mind examined by alien telepaths was terrifying, but it was also the only way to make them understand. "Then let them see the truth," she said, stepping forward into the blue light of the speaking platform. "Because the truth is something that will change everything you think you know about this case."